The morning Yara Mansour corrected Elliot Voss's whiteboard, she was certain she'd be collecting her last paycheck before noon. By the following Thursday, she was sitting at his boardroom table, negotiating a $40 million deal in Arabic, while Elliot watched from across the room with an expression she couldn't quite read. But that Thursday was still a long way off. She had stayed late the night before, working through the empty floors of Voss Capital Partners on Bay Street, the kind of silence that settles over a building only after everyone important has gone home. The strategy room was always last, a wide, glass-walled space on the 32nd floor that looked out over a Toronto skyline still wet from an April rain. The whiteboards were supposed to be erased before she left. That was the job. Erase the boards, empty the bins, wipe down the table. 12 years of cleaning other people's rooms, and she had learned not to read the walls, not to let herself care about what was written there. But that night, she made the mistake of looking. The board was covered in numbers, projections, revenue models, the skeleton of what looked like a significant acquisition strategy. Yara had set her cloth down and stood there a moment longer than she should have, her eyes moving across the figures with the same quiet attention her father had always called her best quality. Joseph Mansour had been an economist in Beirut, a professor well-regarded, with papers published in 3 languages and a classroom full of students who still talked about his lectures 20 years later. When he brought the family to Canada, Yara was 11. He drove a taxi for 6 years while the province figured out what to do with his credentials. He never complained about it. He would sometimes pick her up from school, still in his driving jacket. And they'd stop at a diner and he'd spread a paper napkin on the table and show her patterns in numbers the way other fathers showed their kids card tricks. Numbers always tell the truth, he used to say, even when the person writing them is trying to lie. He died of a heart attack 4 years ago, 2 months before Yara graduated with her MBA from the American University of Beirut. He never got to see it. She had come back to Toronto with her degree and a folder full of application letters, convinced that things would be different, and for a while, she believed that. 43 job interviews in 14 months. 14 made it to the second round. None of them called back. "We're looking for someone who fits our culture," one HR manager had said, in a tone that made the word culture mean something else entirely. She stopped expecting different. So she stood in front of Elliot Voss's whiteboard at 11:15 on a Tuesday night, cloth in hand, not expecting anything, just looking. And then she saw it. It was buried in the third panel, in a line of projected compound growth figures. A small thing, if you didn't know where to look. A percentage applied to the wrong base figure. A mistake that would seem harmless in isolation but would cascade through every downstream projection on the board. If someone built an acquisition offer on these numbers, they'd be off by somewhere between $8 and $12 million. In the wrong direction. Yara stood very still. She knew she should erase the board and go home. She picked up a blue marker instead. She wrote in the smallest print she could manage, right beside the error, in the neat and careful handwriting her father had always insisted on, compound applied to gross, not net, see Q3 base. Actual figure closer to 4.2%. Then she drew a small arrow. She erased the rest of the board. She went home. She did not sleep well. Elliot Voss arrived at the office at 6:45 the next morning, which was normal. He went straight to the strategy room, which was also normal. He stood in front of his whiteboard for 4 minutes without moving, which was not. His assistant Gemma found him still standing there when she came in at 7:30 with his coffee. "Who was in here last night?" he asked. "Just the cleaning crew, building services." "Which of them was in this room?" Gemma checked her phone. "I can find out." He nodded, still looking at the board, at the one panel that hadn't been erased, at the small blue note beside the formula he had built himself, the formula his CFO Wade had reviewed, the formula 3 analysts had signed off on. He pulled out his own calculator and ran the numbers again. Then he stood there a while longer. "Find her," he said. Yara was on the 28th floor when Gemma caught up with her. She had her cart with her, her rubber gloves still on, and when Gemma said, "Mr. Voss would like to speak with you," Yara felt the particular cold of someone who knows exactly what's coming next. She followed Gemma to the strategy room. Elliot Voss was taller than she'd expected, though she had seen him before. Everyone who worked in the building knew who he was. He was standing beside the whiteboard with his arms crossed, and when she came in, he studied her the way people study something that doesn't quite make sense. "You wrote this," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." She kept her voice level. "I'm sorry if it was inappropriate. I can go." "Did I say you could go?" She stopped. "Explain it to me," he said. She looked at him. "The correction?" "The correction." So she explained it. She walked him through the base figure error, the way the compound percentage had been applied to the gross revenue number instead of the net, and how that shifted every subsequent projection on the board. She kept her language plain and direct, the way her father had always taught her. No unnecessary jargon, no hedging, just the truth of what the numbers said. Elliot didn't interrupt. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You went to school for this," he said. "I have a master's degree in finance and economics, yes." "From where?" "The American University of Beirut." Something shifted in his expression, though she couldn't have named what. "And you're on my cleaning crew." "I have rent to pay," she said, "and I've applied for other work. It hasn't gone the way I hoped." He picked up a marker and held it out to her. "The acquisition model is on the third panel," he said. "If the base figure is wrong, show me where else the error propagates." She looked at the marker for a moment, then she took it. She worked through the board for 20 minutes, tracing the downstream effects of the original error, adjusting the figures, flagging 2 additional places where the miscalculation had compounded. She worked in silence, and he watched in silence, and when she was done, she set the marker down and turned around. "This is going to make my CFO very unhappy," Elliot said. "I imagine so. We have a board presentation at 2 o'clock this afternoon." He looked at her steadily. "I'd like you to be there." Yara blinked. "I'm sorry?" "The acquisition committee. 12 people in that room who have spent the last 3 weeks building a strategy on a flawed model. I need someone who can explain the correction without making it sound like the firm is incompetent." He paused. "You explained it to me in under 5 minutes without once making me feel like an idiot. That's a skill." "Mr. Voss." She looked down at her uniform, at the small embroidered logo of the building services company on her chest. "I don't think I should be in that meeting." "Why not?" "Because I'm the person who cleaned the room before the meeting. You're the person who saved a $40 million acquisition offer from going out with a $12 million error in it," he said. "You can be both." She said nothing. "I'll have Gemma find you something to wear," he said, as if that settled it. The board meeting was the most terrifying 90 minutes of Yara's adult life, and she had once applied for 30 jobs in a single month. Elliot introduced her simply, without qualification or apology. "This is Yara Mansour. She identified a material error in our model last night. I've asked her to walk us through the correction." The 12 people in the room looked at her the way people look at something unexpected. Wade, the CFO, looked at her the way people look at something they're not sure they want to understand. She stood up anyway. Later, she would not remember exactly what she said. She remembered being calm, the way she got calm when the numbers were clear and the logic was sound. Not the anxious calm of trying to seem confident, but the real thing, the steadiness that came from simply knowing she was right. She walked them through the error. She showed them the corrected projections. She answered 3 questions from a skeptical senior partner named Aldous without raising her voice once. When she sat back down, there was a silence in the room. Then the discussion resumed, and she realized they were using her numbers. Afterward, Elliot stopped her in the hallway. "You didn't flinch," he said. "I knew I was right," she said. He looked at her for a moment. 43 interviews, he said. She hadn't said that. She had said it hadn't gone the way she'd hoped. She didn't know how he'd arrived at 43. "How did you know that?" she asked. "I had Gemma pull your original application from 2 years ago." He paused. "You applied here for an analyst position." She remembered. She hadn't made it past the first round. "My door's open until 5, he said. "I'd like to talk about a temporary consulting arrangement, if you're interested." She thought about the cart on the 28th floor, the 12 years, the 43 interviews. her father's paper napkins. "I'll be there at 4:30, she said. The next 6 weeks moved in a way that didn't feel entirely real. Yara was brought on as a temporary strategic analyst, on a contract that paid more in a month than she had made in the previous 4. She was assigned a small office on the 31st floor and spent her days rebuilding the acquisition model from the ground up, running scenarios, writing memos in the clean and careful language her father had taught her. She was good at it. She had always known she was good at it. The difference was that now someone else knew too. It was not entirely easy. Wade made his feelings about the situation clear in the particular way of senior finance people who believe hierarchy is a moral good. He was never rude, exactly, but he had a way of forwarding her memos with long lists of concerns that were less about the content than about the fact of her. A junior analyst named Tristan left a printout of her university transcript on the shared printer with a highlighted note that read "Not accredited in Canada." She folded it neatly, put it in her desk drawer, and did not mention it to anyone. Elliot noticed things, she realized. He didn't always act on them immediately, but he noticed. He also worked late. She knew this because she sometimes worked late herself, and the light in his office was always on when she passed the 32nd floor. Once, at 8:30 on a Thursday, she found him in the small kitchen standing over the coffee machine with the look of a man who had been defeated by an appliance. "It's the filter," she said, without really thinking. "The machine is fine. The filter's been put in backwards." He looked at her, then at the machine. Then he stepped aside and she fixed it in about 40 seconds. "How did you know that?" he asked. "I used to maintain these machines," she said. Then, because it seemed simpler than explaining, "I worked on this building for 3 years. He poured 2 cups and handed her one. They stood in that kitchen for almost an hour, and she still wasn't sure afterward how that had happened. They talked about the acquisition, and then about other things. A film she'd seen, a book he'd given up on halfway through, what it had been like to grow up with a father who saw the world in numbers. She told him about Yara Mansour and the paper napkins, and Elliot listened in the way of someone who was actually listening, not just waiting to speak. "My father built this firm," he said when she finished. "He left it to me when I was 31, and I spent the first 2 years terrified I was going to destroy it." He paused. "People thought I would. I heard them talking about it." "What changed?" "I stopped trying to prove I deserved it," he said, "and started just doing the work." Yara thought about that for a long time afterward. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to know. The call from Khalid Al-Farsi came on a Monday morning, when Elliot was in back-to-back meetings and his phone had been forwarded to the general reception line. The receptionist, overwhelmed, newly started, apologetic, sent it to Yara's extension by accident. "Good morning, Voss Capital Partners," Yara answered the way she always answered. "Ahlan," the man on the other end said in Arabic. "Hello." Yara switched without thinking. "Ahlan wa sahlan. Kayf akhdar asadak, welcome. How can I help you?" A short pause, then in Arabic. "You speak Arabic?" "Yes. I apologize. I should have confirmed the language first. How may I help you?" "I'm trying to reach Elliot Voss. I'm Khalid Al-Farsi. I represent an investment group in Dubai. We've been in early discussions about the Meridian acquisition," Yara said. "Yes, I'm familiar with it. Mr. Voss is in meetings this morning, but I can take a message or connect you with his assistant to arrange a call." Another pause, longer this time. "You're familiar with the details?" "I've been part of the analysis team on that file for 6 weeks, yes." "Then perhaps," Khalid said carefully, "you might be willing to speak with me directly. We have questions about the projected northern expansion and whether the risk model accounts for current regulatory conditions." Yara looked at the clock. She looked at the folder open on her desk, the one that happened to contain the northern expansion scenarios she had run the previous week. "I have 45 minutes before my next commitment," she said. "Would that be useful?" It was more than useful. When Elliot came out of his meetings at noon and Gemma handed him the message summary, he read it twice. Then he walked to Yara's office and stood in the doorway. "You spoke with Khalid Al-Farsi for 1 hour and 20 minutes, he said. "He had a lot of questions." In Arabic. That's how he called. Elliot looked at her for a moment. "He sent an email 10 minutes ago. He wants to move the deal to the next stage. He specifically requested that you be part of the negotiation team. Yara set down her pen. That might be awkward to explain. Why? I'm on a temporary contract. Not anymore, Elliot said. The negotiations with Khalid Al-Farsi's group took 3 months. Yara flew to Dubai twice, once in November, once in January, when the city was cooled to something that reminded her of a Beirut spring. She sat at tables with investors who had expected to see a different kind of person, and who learned quickly to revise that expectation. Her Arabic had the Lebanese accent her father had given her, and it opened doors in a way that the firm's previous consultants had spent years trying to pry open with formal English and careful translation. Khalid appreciated nuance. He appreciated someone who understood that a negotiation was also a conversation, and that a conversation had a culture, and that the culture mattered as much as the numbers. "Where did you learn business Arabic?" he asked her once, over tea on his office balcony in the late afternoon light. "My father taught me to read," she said. "He taught me to see what numbers actually mean. The Arabic came from growing up with it." She paused. "He would have loved this meeting." Why didn't he come? He died 4 years ago. She said it simply, the way she'd learned to. He was an economist in Beirut. He moved our family to Canada when I was 11 and drove a taxi for 6 years while the province figured out how to recognize his credentials. Khalid was quiet for a moment. "And you spent 12 years cleaning offices." "I spent 12 years paying my rent," she said. "There's a difference." He smiled. "Your father would have been very proud." She thought about paper napkins, about a diner near her old primary school, about a man who had seen the world in numbers and taught her to do the same. "Yes," she said, "I think he would." Here's something just for the ones who've made it this far. Type snowfall in the comments. You'll know why. The deal closed on a February afternoon when snow was coming down sideways across the Toronto skyline. Yara was in the boardroom, and the boardroom was full of people who had learned her name, and the number on the signed agreement was $42 million in change. Wade shook her hand. It looked like it cost him something. Tristan from the analyst pool sent her an email that said congratulations and nothing else. She wrote back thank you and meant it. Elliot found her afterward in the same kitchen where they had fixed the coffee machine, where she was standing with a cup of tea looking out at the snow. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Like I could sleep for a week," she said. "Take the week. You've earned it." She looked at him. There had been something accumulating between them for months, not stated, not rushed, the kind of thing that builds in small moments, in a kitchen at 8:30, in the way he listened. In the night she told him about her father, and he hadn't said "I'm sorry for your loss" in the reflexive way people do. He had asked what Joseph's favorite paper napkin equation had been. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to be honest." "Okay. Was any of this because you felt guilty? About the original application 2 years ago?" He didn't flinch. "Yes," he said. "At the start, when I pulled your file and saw the rejection letter, I felt guilty. I won't pretend otherwise." "And now?" "Now I've watched you close a $42 million deal in 2 languages while managing office politics that would have broken better resourced people." He paused. "Guilt has nothing to do with it. I'm asking you to stay because you're the best analyst this firm has had in a decade, and because I'd like to keep learning what it looks like when someone does work they actually love." Yara looked at the snow for a moment. "My mother is going to say she told me so," she said. "She's been saying since the first interview that I was meant for this." "Smart woman." "Stubborn," Yara said. "She gets it from my father." He smiled at that. "Can I take you to dinner?" he asked. "To celebrate. Not as your employer, just as someone who would like to have dinner with you." She looked at him carefully. He looked back at her the same way. Not performing, not angling, just there in the February light with the snow coming down, asking a plain question. "Yes," she said. That dinner turned into many dinners. Into evenings where they talked about everything except the deal. Into the morning, 8 months later, when Yara stood in front of 300 people at a financial services conference in Vancouver and told the story of a whiteboard correction, and what it costs to be unseen, and what it is worth to finally be found. She talked about her father, about the taxi, About 12 years of cleaned rooms and 43 rejections. She talked about the night she picked up a blue marker instead of a cloth. Talent doesn't announce itself, she said. It waits. And the question isn't whether it's in the room. The question is whether you're willing to look for it in the right places. The applause was longer than she'd expected. Afterward, a young woman found her near the coffee station. She was maybe 23, wearing the kind of careful professional clothes that meant she had thought hard about what to wear. Her name tag said she was from the event staffing agency, not a speaker, not an attendee, one of the support staff working the registration desk. I have a degree in financial analysis, the young woman said. From the Philippines. I've been applying here for 2 years. She stopped. I just wanted to say, I know what you mean, about not fitting the profile. Yara looked at her for a moment. She took a card from her jacket pocket and wrote her direct email on the back. Send me your CV this week, she said. Not to the general applications inbox, directly to me. She held the card out. And I want you to know, the profile they're looking for isn't always the one they actually need. The young woman looked at the card for a long time. Thank you, she said quietly. Thank my father, Yara said. He taught me that numbers always tell the truth. So do people if you're willing to actually look. She flew back to Toronto that evening, and Elliot was at the gate, not because she'd asked him to be, but because he had looked at her flight time and decided he wanted to be there. He handed her a terrible airport coffee and asked how it had gone, and she told him everything, including the part about the young woman at the registration desk. And he listened the way he always listened, completely, without interruption, as if what she was saying was the only thing in the room that mattered. They drove home through the city in the winter dark. The skyline lit up the way it always was, and somewhere in that city there was a 32nd floor boardroom with a whiteboard that had once held an error and a small blue correction in careful handwriting. And Yara Mansour, who had carried her father's lessons through 12 years of invisible rooms and 43 closed doors, who had picked up a marker on a quiet Tuesday night and written the truth in the smallest print she could manage, was finally, quietly, exactly where she had always been meant to be.